Conversing the Classics, a Classical Youth Society of Ireland podcast dedicated to discussing classics with the subject's experts. My name's Oscar and I'm the founder and chair of CYSI. Today's topic is the Macedonian ruler whose empire stretched from Hellas and Egypt in the west to beyond the Indus River, from the northern stretches of the Arabian Peninsula to the Caucasus Mountains and Bactria. Introducing us to Alexander the Great today is Dr. Shane Wallace, the Walsh Family Lecturer in Classics and Ancient History in Trinity College Dublin. He's also writing 2 papers at the moment, one on Alexander and democracy in the Hellenistic world and one on receptions of Alexander in the Hellenistic and Roman world. Shane, thank you very much for coming
Thanks for having me, Oscar.
to talk to me.
Pleasure to be here.
So I suppose we're just going to dive straight into it. For someone who's talked about and idolised by so many, I mean Julius Caesar, Napoleon, as just sort of a few of the generals who have idolised him, how much do we actually know about him as a person?
Both quite a lot and quite a little. There's a lot of literary sources for Alexander. So the 5 ancient authors surviving who wrote about his campaigns, the first is Arrian, who wrote in the about 2nd century AD, early 2nd century AD. And he wrote a very famous work called the Anabasis, which is probably the most famous and probably the best, actually, surviving source about Alexander from the ancient world. His sources were Ptolemy and Aristobulus, both of whom served with Alexander. In addition to that, we have things like Quintus Curtius Rufus, his History of Alexander, written in the 1st century AD. Plutarch's Life of Alexander, again in the early 2nd century AD. Justin's Epitome of the Philippic History of Pompeius Trogus, books 11 and 12 of that. And much later, Latin work, and book 17 of Diodorus Siculus's World History. So we have an awful lot of literary sources about Alexander, in addition to quite a lot of anecdotes and stories and accounts and references and various other works from Demosthenes, Hyperides and things in the late 4th century up until much, much later authors like Aeneas and Orosius and things. So from that, we know quite a lot about Alexander, but all of that is much, much later. For instance, even the earliest of those, Diodorus Siculus, is 300 years after. The earliest of the surviving Alexander historians is 300 years after Alexander's death. So there's that big gap.
And you mentioned there surviving sources. I mean, do we know of any that have sort of perished, we don't have any more?
Oh, a lot, yes. There's an awful lot of these that we know that no individuals who wrote in the generation contemporary to Alexander and generation after him and even 2 generations thereafter, which simply don't survive. And that's the kind of wall that we encounter. Diodorus Siculus is the earliest surviving continuous narrative source for Alexander's life, book 17 of his Bibliotheca, his World History. A whole huge area of scholarship on Alexander that is focused on trying to piece together these lost sources. And usually that's done by going through the surviving ones. So from Arrian, we can learn a lot about Ptolemy and Aristobulus, who are the sources for Arrian's account. Diodorus 17 is probably based on Clitarchus, who wrote in it's thought to be now the late 3rd century BC in Alexandrian Egypt. Plutarch records a whole wealth of sources about Alexander, some contemporary, some slightly later. But it's through those surviving ones that we try and approach the lost ones. Ptolemy and Aristobulus are the most, perhaps 2 of the better known of them, and the ones that we can perhaps get closest to because they were the basis for Arrian, and quite a lot survives of Arrian. But there's a lot of others as well. 2 of his admirals, Nearchus and Onesicritus, wrote works about Alexander the Great, but neither of those survive, though they are the basis for Arrian's Indica, his kind of ethnographic account about ancient India, which is based on these earlier sources of Onesicritus and Nearchus. And there's others too, but most of them are just names, and what we know about them is relatively little, and it always has to go through that idea of how you approach a lost source. So there's always that kind of difficulty of trying to learn about the lost source from the surviving source, and to what extent can we use what's recorded in surviving sources to extrapolate and try and recreate the missing lost ones.
And I suppose then about the reliability of these sources, I mean, there's obviously going to be pro-Alexander. A lot of people idolise him, as I said slightly earlier on, you hinted at yourself. But I mean, are there sort of ones that you would consider, yes, these are absolutely 100% pro-Alexander, and are there any anti-Alexander sources, any that you would consider actually opposed to what Alexander did or critical of him as a person?
Well, most of the Athenian orators, the only surviving contemporary sources for Alexander, really, the Athenian orators, people like Demosthenes and Aeschines and others, Hyperides as well. So in a lot of those you get a very, very anti-Alexander, very anti-Macedonian image in general.
Yeah.
But that's the Athenian perspective on matters. Athens was the major power, the centre of the world, centre of the Greek world in the 4th century.
Nature.
Yeah, they're approaching Macedon as an outside or a border, semi-barbarized kingdom from the northern borders that had been part of the Athenian Empire, large stretches of it in the 5th century, and now is coming to prominence. So they have an inherent sort of opposition to this shift in the nature of power from Athenian democracy to Macedonian kingship in the 4th century, and they're very opposed to it. There's a lot of pro-Alexander sources. Writing about Alexander became a thing that you kind of had to do in the generation after him. Ptolemy wrote his memoirs, which was a lot of blowing his own trumpet about his campaigns and with Alexander. And there's been quite influential stuff written about bias in Ptolemy's history, so trying to see how he spins things to fit his own agenda. So a lot of this anti-Parmenion being one of Alexander's generals, a lot of the anti-Parmenion material that we have throughout the sources is thought in some degree to go back to Ptolemy and his kind of negative painting of Parmenion and his kind of whitewashing of Alexander's eventual assassination of him. So there are a lot of pro-Alexander sources, and there are some negative Alexander sources as well. The Roman sources for Alexander can be a bit more nuanced in their approach to him, because a lot of Roman emperors and generals, like their Hellenistic predecessors, emulated Alexander quite dramatically. Like you mentioned, we were talking informally earlier about Caesar and weeping before the statue of Alexander in Spain, and this is one good example of it. So a lot of people emulated Alexander, but a lot of literary authors also were careful about the ways in which you emulated Alexander and what you emulated about him. So as a general, you could emulate his military tactics and style and whatever. Pompey with the way he wore his hair.
I was just about to mention Pompey, actually. But,
and earlier ones too, Scipio Africanus particularly also emulated Alexander a lot. But Alexander also then was a byword for megalomania. So when you emulated him in the Roman world, you had to be kind of careful what you emulated, what kind of qualities you took. So the megalomania, the short temper, the execution of your associates and commanders. So Alexander emulation, or imitatio Alexandri, could be both a positive thing and a negative thing, and the Roman sources are a little more nuanced on that than the Greek ones.
Okay, I suppose we've sort of talked a bit about the sources there, so the listener knows that what we're dealing with is a bit sort of like a jigsaw puzzle with a few pieces missing here and there. But I mean, from what we can gather from the sources, what do we know about his early life, about his education and things like that?
Most of what we know about Alexander's early life comes from Plutarch. Plutarch's biography of Alexander. Because of the nature of the work, it's a biography, it starts with the early life. But as with a lot of Plutarch's biographies and a lot of the work that's done on studying people's early lives in antiquity, it's really approached through what he did later in his life. So there's no reason for anyone to be overly interested at the time in Alexander's early life in the 350s or 340s, because he's the son of a Macedonian king. But it's when he reaches greatness then people start to look back on his early life and try and see, well, can we prefigure the greatness in the early life? So you have all these anecdotes about Alexander taming Bucephalus by turning it to the sun so he doesn't see its own shadow, and Philip remarking about how great his son is, or Philip receiving 3 bits of news on one day that he won the Olympic Games, Parmenion had a great victory, and his son Alexander was born, or the story of Alexander being born on the same time as the temple of Artemis in Ephesus burned down because Artemis was away taking care of Olympias while she gave birth to Alexander. So we do know a bit about his early life, but a lot of it is coloured by these kind of legends.
And on that subject of legends, and again going back to interpretation of sources, there's an anecdote about Olympias, his mother, to do with snakes, and that can be interpreted. I've heard that interpreted anyway in sort of 2 different ways. I mean, there's one hand that it shows that she was this image of fertility, but then also that she was sort of an evil witch from away. Like, how would you look at that?
The snake story is a hard one to. This is the famous story of Hercules strangling the snakes in his bed and things. The snakes are also connected with Dionysiac worship. So there's one aspect of it, the idea of the snake impregnating Olympias is perhaps a symbolic of the Dionysiac worship that she might have been connected with, but it's also part of the whole legendary story of Alexander and his divine birth through through Zeus. So
Zeus,
Zeus
yeah.
comes, visits Olympias in the form of a snake. Olympias is impregnated. Alexander is born. And that, Zeus got around a lot, and he likes to pretend to be different animals, be they swans or bulls or eagles, whatever, kidnapping people. And
in terms of his actual, I mean, he's born in, what's the assumed date?
556.
356. Into what sort of lineage is he born into?
Oh, well, he's royal from both sides, from his father's side and his mother's side. Philip, of course, the king of Macedon, and Olympias from the royal family of Epirus. The way of tracing those two back is the Macedonian king would trace his descent from Hercules. That's why the Macedonian kings are sometimes called the Argiads.
Yeah.
Because the idea that they're descended from comes from Argos, so descended ultimately from Hercules. So on that side of his lineage, he has Hercules at the end of it, and on his mother's side, to the Epirot royal family, various other royal lineage, and he goes back to I think the legend is Achilles on his mother's side, if I'm correct. And
which is someone he tries to emulate, which we'll talk about a little later
both Achilles and Hercules, and others too. So from both sides, he's royal on both sides, but importantly, he's not just Macedonian royalty. He's Macedonian royalty and Epirot royalty. Epirus is kind of like modern day Albania. It's to the west of Macedon.
Yeah.
Just along the Adriatic coast.
Okay.
So Epirus and Illyria, places like that.
And in terms of his education, he was born into royalty. What sort of an education did he receive?
Well, the education that would be traditional of Macedonian royalty at the time, which we don't know an awful lot about. There's a lot of, again, stories in Plutarch's Life of Alexander, and in general you get a lot of these stories about Alexander's upbringing. So his tutor... His tutor's name Phoenix, I think it was.
Yeah.
And he called himself Chiron, and Alexander he named Achilles, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
So you have these kind of stories of the Homeric upbringing, a little bit Homeric education. But Aristotle famously was his tutor for a while, and sometimes people tend to overstress this or overemphasize this, that the presence of Aristotle at the Macedonian court. He was Alexander's tutor and he was Alexander's teacher, but he was also for a wider generation. So Alexander's contemporaries who would have been educated with him,
but
like
do we
Ptolemy,
know,
Cassander as well.
Do we know actually how long Aristotle tutored Alexander?
No, we don't know these things.
These are just sort of things that we know he spent some time
We know
with
he
him.
spent time, we know he tutored Alexander, but we don't know how much or what kind of contact that was. Was he the only tutor? Were there other people there as well?
Yeah.
We don't really know what sort of influence did he have on Alexander, and because these are two of the biggest names from classical early Hellenistic history, it's very very appealing to put the two of them together and to think of the great influence of Aristotle, the last great philosopher of classical period, and the influence on the earliest Hellenistic man, Alexander, who founded this new world order. But we really don't know what the relationship between both of them would have been. It seems to have been relatively close. There's no reason to think otherwise, but it can be, I think we can kind of make too much of it quite easily.
And I suppose he is moving on sort of quickly from his early life, because as you said, we don't know too much about it, as is a lot of things with Alexander. It's kind of a
we don't know an awful lot about what education and upbringing would have been like in ancient Macedon, period. Because there's this problem with our sources for ancient Macedon, that we tend to know a lot about the reign of Philip and Alexander, but we don't know a lot about the reigns of kings before that, because no one was interested in Macedon because it was a small
They were kind of
provincial
sheep herders.
Sheep herders, exactly, yeah. So we don't know an awful lot about what happened beforehand. So we know a lot about Philip and Alexander, but to what extent is the evidence for Philip and Alexander indicative of what things would have been like beforehand, or because they're the two monarchs who turned us into a global power, their reigns are going to be the most exceptional and different to what went before. So the evidence we have can tell us a bit about Philip and Alexander, but we don't really know to what extent it tells us anything about what went beforehand. So in general, we have this difficulty. We know a lot about education in the Hellenistic period and royal education, but is that the same as what Alexander would have had? Probably very similar, but if you go back a generation or two earlier in Macedonian kingship, it might have been quite different. We just simply don't know.
But I mean, in terms of even the situation that he's born into, why is it that he happens to be born at a time that Macedon is becoming this sort of rising, maybe not so much a superpower at that point, but it is becoming this steadily growing threat to those around it? Is that just the fact that Philip is a good king and ruler, or is it that there's a certain sort of aspect of the political system in Hellas or in Greece at the time?
That's a good question. I suppose part of it is that Philip, because it's 356 he's born, isn't it? So at the same time as Philip's having an Olympic victory, and Philip's been on the throne for about 3-4 years now.
We've focused ages on his childhood. We should probably sort of move into the things that people will be more familiar with. When does he sort of start emerging and showing promise as a general or taking command, or even defining himself in his father's court?
The earliest I think this happens is, I think the year might be 340, roughly thereabouts. Philip is absent and he leaves Alexander in charge. So Philip's off on campaign and Alexander's left in charge, I suppose as regent, let's say, or something like that.
And where do we know where Philip's campaigning?
No, I don't think so. I don't think we do, actually.
It's just gone off.
Yeah, he's off on a campaign. Alexander's left in charge. He puts down a revolt somewhere or wins a battle somewhere, and he founds a city called Alexandroupolis.
Yeah.
And he gets much better with naming cities as he goes on. Alexandroupolis is not the most, doesn't flow off the tongue.
Yeah.
Although Philip had a Philippopolis as well, which was a plosive piece. But he founds this Alexandroupolis, and that, I think, is the earliest where he starts to get... He's kind of like marked out as the successor by being given control.
Does Philip have other sons that are threatening his...
He has other sons. He has an elder son. So Alexander's an elder brother, a guy called Arrianus, who was born of a Thessalian noblewoman, who's sometimes called a prostitute in the sources because you want to delegitimize her.
Yeah.
But she's a Thessalian noblewoman, Arrianus. He's older than Alexander. I'm not sure how much older, but he has some sort of, don't know exactly what, some sort of mental illness. I'm not exactly sure what. Some people speculate he was poisoned by Olympias. But, Olympias always gets a bad rep.
But, do they go into any description of what the mental illness is? Or?
Not really, no. There's been a lot of speculation about what it is. And we kind of see it after Alexander's death. And we're kind of getting ahead of the story now. We're going from upbringing to death and posthumous reputation. But we kind of see it after Alexander's death. Arrianus has this... It's difficult to pin down exactly what it is. Like there's an example where he's sitting in court because he's one of Alexander's successors, one of the two kings who takes over after Alexander's death. He's sitting in court and there's an Athenian embassy in front of him and there's shouting at one another and he jumps up to... He thinks he's being slandered, so he jumps up to grab a spear to stab one of the Athenian ambassadors and he has to be wrestled to the ground and kind of audience is then cut short. So there's something, but we don't know exactly what it is.
Okay.
But there's something that disqualified him from ruling as Philip's successor, but also notably Alexander felt that it disqualified him from being a threat. So when Alexander becomes king, his elder brother Arrianus is the one person who isn't killed.
Wow.
Which is quite unusual because he killed pretty much every other male relative he had in the extended family. But Arrianus isn't. He's actual older brother, the son of Philip.
He's left, and do
So
we know anything more about him after that? Do we know when he
died?
Yeah.
He Arrianus had quite a colourful life after Alexander's death. He appears briefly through Alexander's campaigns. He seems to have had some sort of religious position. I think Curtius Rufus mentions him having religious authority, or not authority, religious responsibilities at the end of Alexander's life.
But not only did he not see him as a threat, but he seems to, not even sure how you describe it, he seems that he almost doesn't mind him that much. He
brings him with him. He goes on the campaigns with Alexander, and he's in Babylon when Alexander dies, and he's acclaimed king, and his name is changed to Philip. Takes the royal name Philip. He becomes Philip III Arrianus.
So do you think that maybe the reason he didn't have him killed could also have possibly been that the two had a friendship or some kind of fraternal relationship?
Crazy to think of it, isn't it? Two brothers having a fraternal relationship in an ancient Macedonian kingdom. They're usually slaughtering each other. We don't know. We really don't know. It's tempting to speculate in these things, but we simply don't know. Because the sources pay no interest to Arrianus during Alexander's life and times. He appears quite prominently in the very end of Philip's life, when the thing called the Pixodaris affair, where he's kind of being married to one of the daughter of the satrap of Chaeronea, I think it is, and Alexander sees this as a slight on himself, that Philip is privileging Arrianus over himself, and he tries to undermine the marriage alliance. And he's successful, but Philip criticizes him and said, would I have let my heir marry the daughter of the satrap of Chaeronea? So we have a little bit about Arrianus. during Philip's life, but during Alexander's, very, very little. I think that one reference to him in Curtius Rufus having some religious responsibility is it. But after his death, he becomes very, very prominent because he's the only surviving member of the Argead dynasty. So he becomes the go-to person. And when Alexander's son, Alexander IV, is born of Roxanne, posthumously, Alexander's been dead for a few months by this stage. Alexander IV was in utero when Alexander III died. Then he becomes king as well, and they have two kings. First time this happened in Macedonian history. They have just Philip III Aridaeus and Alexander IV as dual kings. And Aridaeus, he lives for about 6 years or so until, in the wars of Alexander's successors, he's eventually killed by Olympias.
But I mean, whatever sort of disability he had, it didn't seem to hinder him in terms of actual fighting ability. It's obviously something just to do with...
Well, fighting, I don't know. There's no references to him fighting, I suppose. Unless you take that bit of him picking up the spear and trying to run through the other person, trying to kill the other person, the Athenian ambassador.
Then he was sort of, I suppose, physically quite
he seems to have been, yeah. Doesn't seem to have been any problem with him. He would have been older than Alexander, so he'd have been probably in his mid-30s by the time Alexander died, a couple of years older. He doesn't really appear to have had much independent action and responsibility after Alexander's death. He and Alexander IV, and indeed the Macedonian court in general, seems to just have been a front for various of Alexander's successors to exercise power through by claiming to be the legitimate successors of Alexander, and kind of they hold control of the court and they exercise authority through it, but really they're the power behind it. People like Perdiccas and then Antipater and then Cassander thereafter.
So I suppose now to move things along, get the ball rolling, we've sort of jumped around the place there. It wasn't my intention.
Quite a bit, actually. Not mine either.
These things happen. Approximately at what stage? I mean, we talked about him naming the city after himself and being left as regent. But when does he start to show promise on the battlefield? I mean, as a military commander.
Well, Philip entrusts him with the cavalry charge at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338.
And who's that against?
Oh, that's against Thebes and Athens.
Thebes, okay.
So, Battle of Chaeronea is really when Philip defeats the powers of Greece, Thebes and Athens, and takes control of mainland Greece, effectively. And Alexander's in charge of the cavalry at that, and he takes down the Theban sacred band, I think. So at that point, he has enough responsibility and enough promise that Philip feels happy to give him responsibility for the cavalry at a major battle.
Wow.
So it's...
And how old is he roughly at that battle?
18, I think.
18, okay, so he's quite young.
Yeah, but
in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, but someone who's been raised in the Macedonian royal court will have had that kind of military political upbringing from the start. So
and we know he definitely did study the Iliad, so he was quite...
Yeah, he knew his warfare.
Yeah.
As he proved quite well through the rest of his life.
And then I suppose to move things along a step further, how is it actually that he ends up becoming king of Macedon, moving from that step of being, as you said, he already has an older brother and he has the court slaughtered, but how does that actually happen, or do we even know how that actually happens?
How he becomes king of Macedon? Well, it mainly happens when his father is assassinated. So Philip is assassinated at his daughter Cleopatra's wedding in 336. And as a result of that, Alexander is pretty much...
Do we know the grounds for Philip's assassination?
Oh, yeah, there seems to be some... He's assassinated by one of his bodyguards, a guy called Pausanias. And there seems to be a kind of sordid sex scandal behind this, that Pausanias had been sexually assaulted earlier by someone who was connected with Attalus, I think it was, who was one of Philip's generals. And Philip didn't... Pausanias told this to Philip, and Philip didn't take any action on it because this guy Attalus was one of his leading generals, and Philip was married to Attilus's daughter, Cleopatra. So Pausanias felt slighted by this and assassinated Philip. Although there are always the murky Olympias in the background. Olympias had a hand in it.
I was just about to say that considering there's all these things, and I could be moving into the thing of conspiracy theories here, but considering there seems to be so much else about Alexander having people killed and doing this, that and the other, do you think it's possible that perhaps he decided, well, maybe once he's had this taste of glory in the battlefield, do you think there is the possibility that he says, well, maybe I'll have my dear old dad knocked off?
Yeah, I don't know. There's nothing that would give us that sense in the sources.
Do we know anything about how Philip and Alexander got on? Was there a good father?
They seem to have gotten on all right, by and large. There there's a number of anecdotes in Plutarch and others as well where they say things like, Philip says to Alexander, "My kingdom won't be big enough for you," and Alexander says to his friends, if my father keeps winning all these battles and capturing all these cities, there'll be nothing left for me afterwards. So there are always these kind of anecdotes and things, but by and large seem to have been okay. There was a quite serious affair in when was it now? I think it was the early 330s, where Alexander was exiled from the court for a short period of time because Philip was getting married. I can't remember exactly what the context of it was. I think it was to do with Philip and Attalus, and Philip marrying his daughter Cleopatra, and Alexander and Olympias too, I think, were out of the court for a short period of time. But they came back soon afterwards, and Alexander seems to have resumed his role as Philip's designated successor and heir. So there is tension. There is definitely tension there, but whether this was... And after the Pixodaris affair too, when Philip was going to marry his son, Aridaeus, to Pixodaris' daughter, I think it was, Satrap of Caria, and Alexander got involved in that and scuppered the deal. Some of Alexander's associates were shortly exiled from the court as well, some of his friends for a short period of time. So I might be mixing the two events together actually, but there are some evidence of kind of conflict and tension, I suppose, but nothing so serious to let us to believe that Alexander in any way planned his father's assassination or got involved in it too. So Olympias is just a lightning rod for all sort of gossip and malicious scandal.
So you think that it's more likely about the sex scandal to do with the bodyguard?
Yeah, it seems to have been something to do with that. There might have been something else at play in the back. Aeneas was never captured alive. He was killed shortly after, almost as soon as he'd assassinated Philip. So with that went any chance of questioning the guy on things. But there's just not enough evidence to speculate on whether or not Alexander was involved in it. But Olympias from very early is connected with this. Yeah.
And you mentioned there slightly earlier that obviously he leads a cavalry charge when he's about 18. By the time he comes to power, is Greece already united under the Macedonian king, or does he have to play some hand in unifying it?
Philip had... Well, the word unite Greece is... The last thing Philip ever wanted was a united Greece, same as Alexander. But they wanted Greece pacified under Macedonian control, which is...
Okay. So in terms of uniting it, they wanted it, I suppose, maybe not united, but they wanted themselves at the top.
Definitely, yeah. The last thing they ever wanted was a united Greece, but they wanted it kind of unified in its disunity.
Yeah.
So individual states, but under Macedonian control. So when Philip had defeated the Athenians and the Thebans at the Battle of Chaeronea, one of the things he founded in the winter of 3387 was what's called the League of Corinth, which was a kind of alliance of city-states based around the state of Corinth, and each city-state would send a delegate to the central council, which was at Corinth, and the Macedonians were the kind of... Philip was elected the hegemon, the leader of this league. It had a military position, ultimately. And this League of Corinth was the organisation through which Greece was unified in a kind of political way, but very strictly under Macedonian control. The Macedonian king was the leader of this League of Corinth, and it was under Macedonian control that the league functioned. So Philip instituted this, and after Philip's death, when Alexander came to the throne, there was a big kind of threat. People in many Greek states thought this is the time to revolt, this is the time to break this thing up. And there were two revolts after Alexander's death, or potential revolts, one in late 336 and one in late 335. And many Greek states...
Sorry, after Alexander's death or after...
Sorry, after Philip's death.
Yeah.
Jesus,
sorry. It's all right.
After Philip... I'm glad you're paying attention. After... Because you'd be full of these slip-ups. After Philip's death, in 336, and then in late 335. And there were numerous Greek states involved in this. Places like Thebes, Athens, Aetolia were implicated in this kind of potential revolt in 336 that Alexander very quickly and peacefully, incidentally, put down. But it was the second one in 335 that was the big problem, and Thebes famously revolted in late 335, and that's when Thebes was destroyed. Alexander destroyed the city of Thebes. But interestingly, he didn't destroy it himself. After he captured Thebes, he passed judgment to the League of Corinth and said, "What do you think I should do with these rebellious Thebans?" And the League said that Thebes should be destroyed and all its property taken, the city razed to the ground, the women, children sold off into to slavery, and any exiled Thebans should not be allowed to return. And then Alexander enacted that. But
do you think that
he was very careful to make sure that blood was on Greek hands, and he was simply carrying out the Greek order.
So you think that there was perhaps something else at play, that he was whispering in the ears of some...
Undoubtedly, yeah, that they knew exactly what Alexander wanted
So,
done, and it was
in other words,
and it was then done. But
yeah, in other words, he sort of, I suppose, in terms of the League, he actually had control over it and could sort of tell people, this is what I want done, this is how I want it.
well, whether it was that he directly told them he wanted this done, or whether it was that people simply understood what would be pleasing to the Macedonian king, or what would be in his interests. And remember, the delegates who would have been sent from the Greek states to this would have been people who were probably pro-Macedonian anyway.
Yeah.
So there were probably some whispering in ears and consultations and whatever, but it was the League that voted officially what was to be done, and Alexander carried that out as hegemon, leader of the League.
Yeah.
And that was the organisation that was in place in Greece to keep it stable and pacified under Macedonian control while he was abroad. So when he was campaigning from 334 to 323 in Asia, it was the League of Corinth that was still in existence back in Greece, and it becomes less and less prominent. We have fewer and fewer references to it, but Antipater, who was left behind as governor of Macedon, seems to have been the person who was in charge of Macedonian relations with the League at that time.
And I suppose then he what he is most known for is his expansion of his empire into the east, and he takes apart the Persian Empire, which was kind of, I suppose, the superpower in the world at the time.
Yeah, the global superpower.
Yeah. What makes him decide to sort of move into Persia and start? Is it this lust for power that he is so famous for, or is there something sort of more political about it?
Well, mainly the thing was that Philip had started it. So Philip had... The war against Persia had been declared by the League of Corinth under Philip, and Philip had began that war. So in the last year of his life, in 336, he had sent over, or 337 I think it was actually, he sent over was it 336? I can't remember. But he sent over an expeditionary force with these two generals, Parmenion and Attalus, who'd conquered quite a lot of Western Asia Minor. And then after Philip's assassination and Alexander stabilising the empire, a lot of that progress was pushed back. But mainly it was Philip had started this, he had begun this, so it was up to Alexander to continue what Philip had begun and enacted. And Alexander was not a person who let the potential for glory and military conquest pass him by. So it was, for him, fit him like a glove. This is exactly the kind of thing that he wanted to do and wanted to be part of. Whether or not pushing as far as Afghanistan and Pakistan and borders of modern India was what Philip had planned is perhaps pushing it a bit further. Philip may have had more modest goals, but he definitely enacted and continued that something that had begun by his father, but his own lust for glory or his own military interest, I suppose, would have pushed him that way.
Yeah. So I know your actual your focus is mostly on Alexander as a character and trying to piece together and his rulings as well, but I suppose the battles are something that usually captivate a lot of people. Could you talk us a little bit through his first encounter with the Persians at the Battle of Granicus?
Yeah, the Battle of Granicus was the first one where he met the Persians in pitched battle. He fought three...
Roughly what year?
This is 336, and I think it was about May, something like May 336. Something like that, so late
summer.
Spring, early summer. I think it's May, I might be wrong. But he met the Battle of Granicus, and this is the first battle. There were three major ones against the Persian king: the Battle of Granicus, Battle of Issus, and then Gaugamela. But at the Battle of Granicus, he didn't actually meet the Persian king in battle. It was an alliance of satraps. So the satraps are the kind of...
And who is king of the Persian Empire at the
Darius
time?
III.
Darius III,
Yeah.
okay.
So it's an alliance of Persian satraps. A satrap is a kind of local governor of a province, a regional province in the Persian Empire. So places like Ionia or Caria or Hellespontine, Phrygia, places like that. So it was an alliance of Persian satraps that met him at the Battle of Granicus. Granicus is a river in northern Turkey, modern-day Turkey. It's not a particularly impressive river to look at. But the notable thing about Alexander's victory at Granicus was that it was a victory. And it was...
And was it kind of decisive?
Well, it was. Each of his victories opened up a region of the Persian Empire to him. So the Battle of Granicus opened up pretty much modern-day Turkey to Alexander. And next, when he fought the Persians at the Battle of Issus, it was in modern day Syria, I think it is. So the Battle of Granicus, that victory pretty much gave Alexander, most of all Western Asia Minor and most of modern day Turkey was open to him after that. The impressive thing about it was that it was fought over a river. So Alexander's the Macedonian phalanx, had to march into the river and up the bank on the other side, where the Persian cavalry and archers were placed. This is the thing with Alexander. He won battles marching across the river. He won pitched battles, sieges, mountaintop sieges of island fortresses. It was just remarkable.
He obviously was a military genius.
Yeah, and he had that infrastructure. This is one thing that often gets forgotten with Alexander. It's always like Alexander was a genius, but the infrastructure was there and the expertise was there from Philip. And that generation that Philip had that generation of, because I think of 2 or 3 generations here of Macedonian excellence.
Yeah.
Started with Philip, Alexander's generation, and then the subsequent generation too.
But I suppose in terms of logistics, he engages this great empire, this sort of global superpower, as you said slightly earlier on. He engages with the Macedonian force. How many men does he bring in to the Persian Empire, and how many men roughly is he facing? And in terms of source interpretation, how does that vary?
Well, I think he brings roughly, I'm terrible with numbers and dates and things, but I think he brings roughly about 30,000 or just over 30,000. He has a fleet at the start, but he very quickly gets rid of it.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't too interested in naval battles. He wanted to defeat the Persian Empire by land, not by sea. So he brings just over 30,000 men. I can't remember how many thousand cavalry, but again, a very, very solid, very powerful and important cavalry. I just can't remember the numbers of it. So he brings that over. The scale of what he's facing in Persia, now that's... The Greek sources have a tradition of saying the Persian army was 1 million people.
Yeah,
it's not sure how many I think at the Battle of Issus it's like 30,000 against 200,000 or something ridiculous like that. But he's probably facing a Persian army that numbers less than 100,000, but...
It's still significant.
It's very significant. One way to approach it is to kind of think, well, what do his successors field? So his successors, people like Antigonus, who at one point in time controlled pretty much everything from Afghanistan,
and
Pakistan.
Where's Antigonus ruling?
Well, this is what I'm getting at. Antigonus, at various points in time, controlled large portions of Alexander's empire, but at his maximum extent, he controlled pretty much most from Western Asia Minor to Afghanistan, Pakistan, or then thereafter the Seleucid Empire, which at its peak controlled everything from Egypt, the border of Egypt, up to the Aegean world and Macedon and Thrace, actually, for a very, very short period of time, all the way over to Bactria, Pakistan, Afghanistan. Even at their peak, those massive empires, they still fielded armies about the size of 70 to 80,000 at the maximum.
Yeah.
So comparatively, that's probably the same kind of scale that the Persian king could field.
Okay.
Maybe slightly more, but I'd say we're dealing with Alexander facing maybe odds of at the max 3-1, something.
3-1, which is still considerable odds to win a battle.
Still considerable odds, yeah. But he has the most technologically advanced, well-trained and professional army that the world has ever seen.
I suppose even to talk about sources a little more, there's points about his height, that he's tiny and all the Persian generals are huge.
Yeah, there is stuff like that when he takes... the Persian king used to sit on his throne and he always had a footrest.
Yeah.
Because the Persian king should never touch the ground. So when he appears on a chariot, on horseback, or walking on purple, or he's depicted seated.
But that's probably where they get it from, is it?
Yeah, there's a story of Alexander getting in and sitting up on the throne, the Persian throne, and his feet don't touch the stool. There's a adorable little image of like Alexander sitting on these comically large chairs, waving his feet back and forth. But
and how tall, this is kind of a really silly question, but I mean, do we have it? Because it is something that's talked about, and I know Napoleon prided himself for being short like Alexander. Do we actually have any sort of idea of
his size?
Yeah, or do we just...
I don't know.
It's just kind of a guessing game.
Plutarch. Plutarch gives a good bit of biological information about Alexander. He talks about his colour of his hair, how his skin smelled really nice all the time. The kind of his complexion, things like this. I don't think he gives us any information on his height. Of course, people were a lot smaller back then than they are now.
Yeah,
so Alexander might have been 5'6"
size.
or something and been relatively, normal sort of size. Like, there's also people get these stories attached to them. So the stories of Napoleon being small, I think a lot of them are British kind of propaganda. That there's an account of a British ambassador meeting Napoleon and being shocked that he didn't look like some tiny, physically deformed freak, because that was the way the British had been representing him for so long. So I think Napoleon wasn't any smaller than what would have been average at the time. Maybe the Duke of Wellington was slightly taller.
But
who Alexander was facing, Darius III, was this is someone who was had won single combat before, and he'd have been maybe not a particularly tall guy, but he wasn't small either. So
yeah,
I really don't know actually to get a straight answer to it. I don't know how tall Alexander would have been. I don't know if we can figure out how tall he would have been.
Once again, we've got to bring it all back, I suppose, into context. He wins the Battle of Granicus.
Yeah.
With his nice smelling skin.
Lovely smelling skin.
And this begins the famous life of Alexander. Where does he go from here? I mean, he moves further into Asia Minor and into the Persian Empire. What happens?
After Granicus, as I said, most of what is modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, opens up to Alexander. So he moves south, kind of mopping up any bits of resistance. And there's an awful lot of resistance to Alexander. He devotes his time to land campaigns, and he seems to have this idea that he's going to defeat the Persian Empire by land. And the Persian Empire is a very strong naval power in the Aegean world and the Western Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean. So that makes things difficult for Alexander. He bypasses areas like Ionia and Aeolia, where most of the Greek city-states are, places like Mytilene and Chios and island states like this. And he sends delegates, he sends subordinates to mop up these areas. But he marches south, he passes by places like Priene, Erythrae, he comes to Ephesus, Halicarnassus, and he fights this really kind of, a lot of it's done while Alexander pushes further east, but while he is pushing further east, there's this huge series of this very long process of back and forth taking place in the Aegean world, where Alexander is initially victorious in 334, and a lot of the Greek city-states on the islands and western Greece come to his side. But in 333, the Persian general Memnon, a Greek from Rhodes, I think, who's in charge of the Persian fleet, leads a counterattack and takes control of most of these island states again in the cities of Western Asia Minor, and they come back to the Macedonian side in 332. So there's this very, very long process of, while Alexander's marching down through Asia Minor, then marching into Syria and to Egypt and everything, there's this long warfare that's taking place in the Aegean world. It takes a very, very long time to come to conclusion. And there's some major events in that, like the siege of Halicarnassus is a big one that takes a very long time.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
The siege of Halicarnassus, God, I don't know an awful lot about it. It takes a very, very long time. Halicarnassus was one of these kind of fortified cities in southwestern modern-day Turkey in the area of Caria, famous for the mausoleum of Halicarnassus and Mausolus, the satrap of Halicarnassus, an independent dynast for a while. And the siege of Halicarnassus takes quite a bit of time. It was one of the major Persian naval bases in the Western Mediterranean. And it's only after a series of quite touch and go, Macedonians almost don't win it, that it eventually comes to the Macedonian side, and they do win it. But I can't remember who the commander was who conquered it.
Surely as they're going along, I'm just thinking in terms of the actual armies themselves, he has 30,000 going in. Surely he is recruiting mercenaries and Persian troops as he goes, people who are willing to come over and join him.
Maybe not the Persian troops, but he is constantly calling for reinforcements from Greece.
So there are people coming back. But it's not
there's an awful lot of, there's a number of examples, I can't remember how many or what the numbers are, where he sends people back to, he'll send troops back to Macedon for a winter, and the idea is they go home.
Which was uncommon, I suppose, in the ancient world.
The other idea is you go home to your families and your wives, and you might have another 600 births next summer, so kind of keeps it going. And Antipater was always sending reinforcements over to Alexander as well. The Greek states too. He had a series of Greeks who were recruited through the League of Corinth, and there were mercenaries as well who he was recruiting. It wasn't until much later that he starts recruiting the Persians into the army, particularly the cavalry first of all to begin with, and then later into the hoplite phalanx, the Macedonian phalanx. He recruits 10,000 Persians at the very end of his life. So he's recruiting these as he goes, but he's also constantly losing people. So there's the constant losses through warfare, but leaving behind the forces or garrisons, splintering the army as well to give one person, 800 troops to go off and do something else. So it's a very mobile and very dynamic force, and it's constantly being replenished from Macedon, but constantly broken off as well as various outposts are founded or garrisons are left behind. And something like the siege of Halicarnassus takes a lot of troops while he is then pushing further east himself.
Wow. Okay, so he was obviously he obviously has some kind of insane vision for
insane vision.
in terms of now, he moves into Syria and he reaches a place, an island called Tyre, and he does something really quite amazing and quite unheard of at the time. Do you want to tell us a little
The
bit
siege of
more?
Tyre.
Yeah.
This is something special. He gets to Tyre, and there's both Old Tyre and New Tyre. So Tyre is an island, an island state, and it's a kind of fortified island. It's not far off the coast, but still, you know, you need a navy to attack it and besiege it. And then there's New Tyre, which is on the mainland. And New Tyre comes to his side, but he in Tyre says that it will come to Alexander's side as well, but he demands that he be let onto the island of Tyre to sacrifice to Hercules. Okay. Because there's this tradition of Tyrian Hercules. So there's many different Herculeses in antiquity.
Yeah.
Herodotus writes about this, and he says there's a Hercules from Tyre, one from Egypt, one from the Greek world. So he wants to go, he says Hercules came to him in a vision, and he wants to go sacrifice on the island to Hercules. But the Tyrians realize that, well, you know, this is Alexander saying he wants us to, you know, submit in a very dramatic fashion to him and allow his army onto our island, which they refuse to do. So therefore Alexander says, well, if you don't come to my side, I will capture you. So he initiates this siege of Tyre, which takes most of, God, how long is it? It's 333, I think it is. It takes almost the whole of 333, almost like 9 months. And he builds this huge, what's the word? It just literally fills in the sea, and he builds this causeway out to the island.
I mean, logistically,
and he takes it by land.
But
It's
logistically,
remarkable.
how does he manage to do? How does he manage to fill it? Like, is it a bridge, or is it actually that he builds a whole?
Tyre today is connected to the mainland because the causeway he built out to it silted up over the years, and the city of Tyre nowadays is it's connected physically with the mainland because his causeway over the years has silted up so much, and it's
How did he manage? Like,
fully urbanized.
Was it sort of gravel and things like this that
Yeah.
he was packing in?
big rocks just filling in the sea, connecting. This is the Xerxes connection, you know.
Yeah.
Xerxes marches his army across the sea
Hell-
and sails his ships across the land.
Hellespontans.
And Alexander's doing something similar. It takes
Yeah.
about 9 months, 10 months, but he captures Tyre by land. He captures an island by land. And that's the scale of the logistics of this. It's mind-boggling. And he celebrates these big games after it. We have an inscription from Macedon by a guy called Antigonus, not the famous Antigonus who was his successor, who says that, you know, he won at the games in honor of Hercules at Tyre that Alexander put on. So he seems to have had this big celebration after this.
Yeah, we'll talk about his proclamation of as the son of Zeus, or theorized proclamation.
Yeah.
But I mean, you can tell why he kind of got this idea that, oh, maybe I am the son of a god. Why other people might have thought, because these amazing feats that he's just able to seemingly dream up.
It's much more impressive.
Realize
it's much more impressive when you put it in the context of Greek siege warfare, which was not something that the Greeks really practiced an awful lot. In the 5th century, like when you besieged the city, you basically just went there and sat outside.
And just waited.
You just
waited for them
waited.
to starve out,
Waited till they starved out. You didn't have ballistae and catapults and things
same
and
as the Romans
sappers
did,
and knocking down the walls. You really just waited. That was it. You
Yeah.
just waited for them to come. It was only in the 4th century, Dionysius of Syracuse, really, when they started to develop siege warfare. And what Alexander did was it's not something that he started himself. It would have begun with Philip. And that's, again, another one of these things to stress continually, that a lot of the foundation for what Alexander did came from Philip. And the expertise in siege warfare was developed from Philip and reached its zenith with Alexander. But it's a remarkable achievement by itself, even more remarkable in the context of Greek siege warfare. And he followed it up with another one. He besieged the Citadel of Gaza. Yeah. And then he
we were talking about the Persian Gate there a little bit, but I actually we're quite pressed for time, so we should probably, something that I do want to talk about though is the Gordian Knot, because it is really it's again one of these sort of myth or fact situations, but it seems to capture what I would imagine, and I'm sure a lot of other people would imagine, as very sort of defining in Alexander's personality. What can you talk us through the Gordian Knot?
Yeah, we're going back in time again a bit now. We're jumping back from Syria back to Asia Minor.
We're all over the place in this anyway.
But he marched down through Western Asia Minor and then down through what would have been southern Turkey, pretty much along the coast. And he took this major detour inland right to the centre of modern day Turkey before he then came down south through the Syrian gates into Syria. So it's a huge detour, and he goes right through Gordian. And while there's this story of the Gordian Knot, that Gordian was the father of Midas.
Yeah. The golden touch.
Yes, and Gordian was became king, and there was a legend about his kingship that they were the oracle said, make king the next person you see, and it was Gordian who came by with this chariot with a big knot in it. So the idea was that whoever can open the knot or untie the knot of Gordian would become king of Asia. So Alexander gets to it, and obviously he can't untie the knot, so he has this quintessentially Alexander solution where he pulls out the sword and just slices the thing in half. Or the other story is that he pulled out the pin, because there's a pin connecting the chariots to the...
That's a slightly more pro-Alexander, I would say.
He just pulls out the pin and then the knot falls apart because he hasn't untied the knot, he's just pulled out the pin that held it together. But yeah, so...
Do you think that story's true?
I'd see no reason to doubt it.
That it is definitely, and
there's something to do with Alexander at Gordian and the knot and untying it.
Do we have other references that the Gordian knot was actually there? It was a historical...
Good point. I don't know.
But he definitely
I don't know. Outside the Alexander historians, I don't know.
He definitely did something decisive at Gordia.
Yeah, without a doubt.
We can kind of assume.
He took this title then afterwards, and he's, at least from the Battle of Gaugamela onwards, he calls himself King of Asia. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose then, feeding it nicely, he comes to the end of sort of dismantling the Persian Empire, and Gaugamela is kind of, I think it really is his most famous battle. He's in his 30s at this stage, am I right? I've got the chronology. Maybe he's a bit younger than that.
No, he's not in his 30s. He dies about 32. So when was he? 356 and wins Battle of Gaugamela. It's the end of 331. So he'd have been, 25?
Okay, so no, he's a good bit.
He's precocious.
Yeah. So Gaugamela, what happens?
Battle of Gaugamela, sometimes called the Battle of Arbela because Gaugamela is a mouthful, and Arbela was a little town nearby that has a nicer name to it. So sometimes they called it the Battle of Arbela.
And is Gaugamela a city or is it a plain?
But the town nearby was the town of Arbela. Gaugamela is just the region, the area. It's in it's between the two rivers, I think, in Mesopotamia.
And in terms of actually, I suppose, relating it back to jumping all back. In terms of his battles, can we be fairly sure the sites of various battles that he fought, or is it usually, it just happened in this region, but we're not really sure where? Or are there?
I don't think we found the actual battle sites themselves, but the crossing of the river Granicus, Issus in Syria, these are pretty well located, but we might not know the actual battle site itself.
Would there be any archaeological evidence left at these battle sites, or are we? We're just as good as guessing.
I don't think so.
Okay.
Nothing I know of.
It's all just out there.
It'd be interesting to know if they had found the site, but I don't think they found the actual battle site. Usually you can find the battle site because
we know the regions more or less.
Yeah, very closely. Very closely.
So, sorry, back to Gaugamela. So he engages, here is when he actually meets...
Yes, the second time he meets Darius. Yeah, first time was at the Battle of Issus, the second is the Battle of Gaugamela. He meets Darius in battle, and both times it's a Macedonian victory.
Yeah.
Gaugamela is quite decisive because it's the second victory. So after he defeated Darius at the Battle of Issus, he went into Egypt. Again, Darius had time to build up a new army, and this is a really decisive one.
Again, in terms of troop numbers and actual army sizes, what are we looking at?
Something similar again. I'm not sure of the exact numbers. I can't remember off the top of my head, but again, it'll be something similar in terms about, on the Macedonian side, roughly something like 30,000 against the Persian side, which would be something from 60 to 80, I'd reckon.
All right.
But I'm not sure of the exact precise numbers. The reason is because after the Battle of Issus, rather than chasing Darius, as you might have expected Alexander to do, he let Darius go. He let him flee. And Darius went back to the Persian heartland, Mesopotamia, modern Iran, and the area of Persis, and he recruited a second major army while Alexander went and took Egypt. So Darius had a good 2 years to build up another army to fight Alexander and to learn from it. So there's no reason to think he didn't field as strong an army as he had the first time.
So there was again good balance and sort of they were about equally matched. So I suppose moving away from sort of the military side, because I know that's not sort of your area, in terms of his personal life and his sort of ruling, do we know anything about his marriages, his children? I know his sexuality is something that also comes under fire.
His sexuality always comes up, his marriage and children. Well, he had... Alexander's one of these guys who, in the sources, has a kind of seems a strange relationship with women. Very, very respectful, deferential relationship to women.
Which is outrageous for...
It's outrageous for...
a 5th century or a 4th century, Greek to be nice to women.
Respectful relationships to women are not something you associate with ancient militaries. But, for instance, when he defeats Darius at Battle of Issus, he captures Darius' tent, and in his tent is his wife and his daughter, and Alexander treats them with the utmost respect and dignity, and Darius apparently comments on that as well at some point. it's very tempting to see this strong female figure in his life through his mother Olympias as well. But he doesn't take a wife until quite late in his life. Apparently people like Antipater and others had been asking him to stay in Macedon for a few years, marry, have a child, so that the stability of the empire is ensured before he goes east. Because if he goes east, what happens if he dies? There's no one to take over after him.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Alexander, being Alexander, doesn't listen to that. So he has a number of dalliances. There's a record of him having an affair with a woman called Barsine and having a child named Heracles from her. He eventually, the courtesan, Athenian courtesan woman named Thais is in his entourage, although we don't know if she was there as a romantic connection with Alexander or simply just a courtesan who was in the court, which often happens. You have these people around for as part of a court.
Yeah.
But it's mainly he meets Roxanne. He marries Roxanne, the daughter of Oxyarthes, I think, or Oxyarthes, who's a kind of satrap of Sogdia. Sogdia is a region in kind of southern Afghanistan today, maybe portions of northeastern Iran as well. And he marries Roxanne mainly as, it seems to be, as a way of stabilizing a dangerous frontier border province.
But I mean, in terms of the politics of that seems a little unusual, because you've got this, on the one hand, you have all these people urging him to stay in Macedon, marry a Macedonian, continue the line, and then he runs off with this Eastern woman. Surely that must have annoyed.
It's quite remarkable. It must have, yeah. But it's part of this much wider process that you find with as he goes further east in the empire, which is he integrates and accommodates an awful lot more the Persian and non-Greek elements of the empire that he's just recently taken over. And there's a pragmatic side to this as well, which is that marrying Roxanne is a way of stabilizing what is today, I suppose, modern Afghanistan. He brings that, because he spends something like 4 years nearly fighting in Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan.
But I mean, even then, and
the marriage alliance is a way of stabilizing this.
But I mean, even then, do we know that after he defeats people like Darius the first time and indeed the second time, do the people receive him quite well? I mean, I know Egypt is said to have received him quite well, but I mean, in the greater scheme of things, is he well received?
Egypt does. Babylon opens its doors to him willingly. There's no battle there. All the Persian heartland, Babylon, Opis, Ecbatana, even Persepolis, they all come willingly to Alexander's side. Persepolis, he hands the city over to the troops and they sack it, and then the palace is burned down by him, or by some accounts by the courtesan Thais of Athens.
Yeah.
But there doesn't seem to be anything. No, very, very little. You get revolts he has a lot of difficulty stabilizing the areas of what are modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, places like that. That's where he has the difficulty, as all empires do when they go into that part of the world. Even after his death, the people who revolt, the only revolts are the Greek world. The Greek settlers in the east and the Greeks, Athens, in mainland Greece.
Right. So
the rest of the empire is stable.
He seems to but so I suppose...
Whether it's he's liked or the ruling authority is stable,
does he
slightly different.
Does he keep up the same sort of policies that the Persian government had instilled?
It seems to be that by and large what he does is he simply takes the head off the pyramid and just replaces it with himself.
Well, then that seems probably the likely reason why he wasn't met with too much opposition, because people didn't care as long as they got to keep living.
Numerous Persian satraps were reconfirmed in their posts. Now, they were a minority compared to Macedonian satraps.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of Persians who were integrated into the court quite prominently. He integrates Persian features in terms of having eunuchs and announcers and food tasters and things like this. So he takes over an awful lot of features of Persian kingship and Persian administration and governance. And it makes sense, why the Persians have ruled this empire for, nearly 250 years. So why get rid of something that is proven success?
Yeah.
He by and large keeps the same system.
I suppose moving it along, because we're running a little over time, but it's all right. How does all this newfound power and godlike status go to his head, and does his treatment of his Macedonian troops, generals and advisors, sort of stay constant throughout his campaign, or does this power just go to his head and he just starts...
Yeah. It's two different ways of thinking of it. Things do change, and he does act an awful lot different as he goes through his life. The way he treats his subjects at the end of his life is very different to the way he's treated them at the start. Whether that's connected with something like belief in his own divinity and godlike status is perhaps the way the sources try and represent this Eastern barbarism and sycophancy has corrupted a weak mind. Perhaps, but he does treat them differently. At the start of his career, when he interacts with the Greeks, it's through this mechanism of the League of Corinth, and there's deference to the idea of Greek authority through that. And he's very careful to defer frequently to his Macedonian advisors, members of the military, because when he takes control, it's Philip's generation who are in charge. People like Clitus and Parmenion.
Does he treat people like Clitus and
Parmenion? Well, at the start of his career, yeah, he treats people like Clitus quite well, and Parmenion is deferred to a lot for authority and influence. But when we read Arrian, it's always that Parmenion gives him a bit of advice and Alexander tells the opposite. But over time, he treats these with less and less respect. And part of the reason seems to be just a generational shift. He prefers to defer to his own people from his own generation. So Parmenion is eventually assassinated because his son Philotas was implicated in a threat to Alexander. Clitus is killed at a drunken banquet in Maracanda.
By Alexander?
By Alexander, run through by Alexander, yeah.
And do we know why he decides to kill?
Well, it's not really certain why. There's
that he was drunk.
Well, they were drunk, yeah. Clitus had been insulting Alexander at a drunken banquet, saying that, making fun of Alexander for his disavowal of Philip. He's claimed that Zeus Ammon was his father. There apparently had been a play or a poem or a song that had been performed that was making fun of a Macedonian expedition that had been defeated. So there's a whole connection of ideas, but there was alcohol was involved, and Alexander had a spear and Clitus was insulting him, and Clitus was eventually killed. But there is this movement, this change of generations, and that happens during the course of his campaigns, and he the new generation, people like Ptolemy and Craterus and Perdiccas and Seleucus and things come to the fore because they're Alexander's generation, and they're perhaps loyal to Alexander rather than loyal to the kingship.
But I mean, in terms of after you say he kills Clitus, who is, of course, one of the advisors that comes from Philip and probably quite a good friend of Philip, going back that far.
One of the leading generals, yeah.
Does he show sort of remorse after killing her, or does he just move?
Oh, no, he shows remorse after the killing of Clitus, as he does at numerous other points in time. There's a famous scene after the killing of Clitus where Alexander is out of it, and he's crying and he's really upset about this. And Callisthenes comes to try, a philosopher who's at the court, Callisthenes, comes to try and console him. And then after him, another philosopher at the court, Anaxarchus, comes. And Anaxarchus says to him that, kind of laughs at him, why are you crying? There's a reason why in art and in literature we place justice next to Zeus, because whatever Zeus does is just by virtue of the fact that he does it. So you are a king, and what you do is just by virtue of the fact that you are a king. So if you killed Clitus, that was the right thing to do, because you did it, because you're the king. So he does show an intense remorse for this, a kind of Achillean remorse in the sense of locking himself in his tent for days on end and crying. And
again, there was the idea is that he carried, everywhere he went, he carried a copy of the Iliad.
The two things under his pillow, the Iliad and the dagger, which neatly sums up the Hellenistic world, which is literature and warfare. But
I suppose then, to move it on, his later life. I suppose later life, he dies quite young, but I mean...
Yeah, his later life is his late 20s and early 30s.
Yeah, which is...
Just sobering thought, for us today.
But I mean, where does he spend it? He's still on campaign, obviously, until the age of 25.
Right up until his death. He's fighting in the east until 327, something like that. And then he eventually comes south down the Indus Valley.
And where does he die?
He dies in Babylon.
He dies in Babylon,
323, June 323. We know the day, we even know the time of the day because of cuneiform documents from Babylon.
Fantastic.
Solar things.
Do we know
the stars of
obviously such a young death? It was quite common, I suppose, in the ancient world, but I mean, do we know what caused it? I mean,
no, not really. There's been a lot of thinking about what was the cause of his death. Did he die from a disease, something like typhoid or West Nile encephalitis or something like this? Or was it to do with, because, Babylon, marshes, and malaria is very prominent. Or was it to do with simple over-drinking, something like that?
Yeah. He was known for his drinking.
The sources say, huge banquet a few days before he died. He drinks this massive, massive toast, and he gets a sharp stabbing pain in his side. So alcohol poisoning might have been part of it. But Alexander was also worn down. His body had been brutalized over the previous
I suppose you're on
12, 13 years.
campaign
He'd almost
plan.
died a few times. He had a punctured lung. He almost died from a fever in Cilicia before the Battle of
Yeah.
Issus. So the punctured lung was he almost died there, actually.
What happens to his empire after? Well, we mentioned it earlier and we alluded to it, but what happens after his death? I mean, does it stay together for any length of time?
Nominally, it stays together in name for quite a while, for at least until 311 thereabouts, 310, it stays together in name. But it slowly fragments. Now, it's not an inevitable process. There were people who tried to keep his empire together, but over time it fragments and it turns into what we call the Hellenistic empires.
Yeah.
The Antigonid Empire in Macedon and mainland Greece, the Seleucid Empire, which covers most of Asia Minor up to, at its largest, the borders of India, but mostly up to Pakistan, Afghanistan. And the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt, which controls Egypt, North Africa, Cyrene, and a lot of the Aegean islands, fragments into those. But it's a long process. After his death, he is succeeded by his elder brother, Aeneas, as we mentioned, who becomes Philip III, and then his son, who's born posthumously, becomes Alexander IV. And they are the kings, they're the figureheads. But through the wars of his successors, who are the real power in the empire, that facade of the Argead dynasty, the successors of Alexander, and the idea of a king of Alexander's empire, that facade is eventually worn down. So Philip III and his wife Aedea Eurydice are killed by Olympias in 317, and Alexander IV, Alexander's son, survives until the age of about 13 or so, and then he's eventually killed by Cassander in Macedon, or executed on his order. Philip Alexander IV and his mother, Alexander's wife Roxanne, are killed. And then there's various pretenders to the throne are raised, such as Heracles, the son of Barcine, and eventually the dynasty implodes and is eventually killed off.
The key detail is that the empire sort of disbands into these little...
It does, but it takes time, for it to fall, and it's not an inevitable process. And there are many who
it's
try...
It's not like it collapses in flames. I mean, there's still... You still got Alexandria, the Ptolemies, who last right up until Julius Caesar. I mean...
They're the last of the ones to go.
The Seleucids...
Seleucid Empire too,
Things like
and
that.
at various point in time, some of these people try to reunite the empire. So Antigonus tries to... One of his major important successors tries to reunite the whole empire. And Seleucus, at one point in time, shortly before his death, controls everything from Macedon. He controls all of Alexander's empire except Egypt. So there are times when the idea of Alexander's empire is great and they try to recreate it.
Yeah.
But it does implode, but it takes a generation or so for it to happen.
Okay.
In hindsight, it's an inevitable process, but at the time it perhaps wasn't.
And there is, there's rumours that he deifies himself within his own lifetime. He was certainly deified towards the end of his life. I mean, he was viewed as a god, and I think even if it wasn't officially, you could informally say he was viewed as a god, with so many people idolising him. How does his god... how does it develop after his death? It's a big question, but just sort of...
But it develops before he died, actually.
So you believe that he definitely did issue an edict declaring himself son of Zeus and a god? Do you?
I don't know that he did an edict, but the idea of him going to the Oracle of Zeus Ammon at Siwa and being declared the son of God seems pretty solid. There was something there that he recognised him as the son of God, because he announced it then at the Battle of Gaugamela. He says, if I'm descended from Zeus, then give me victory.
Yeah.
But Greek oracles were announcing him as the son of Zeus during his lifetime as well. The Oracle of the Branchidae.
Mentioning oracles. Right.
And there is evidence that he was deified in Greek cities during his lifetime.
Even sort
Plenty
of
of
branching off. He has interesting relationships with oracles. There's ones of him, obviously with the Oracle of Siwa. One of my favourite stories from the classical world is before he goes off and campaigns to Persia, he goes to the Delphic Oracle.
Oh yeah, the Delphi one, that's great, yeah.
Do you want to tell us?
Yeah, well, he goes to Delphi and he asks for an oracle from the priestess, and she says, the prophetess, and she says that they're not doing oracles that day or something, or
she only sits at like 3 days a year.
Yeah, there's a reason that they're not getting oracles. And he refuses to go, so he drags her, and he says, "You're giving me an oracle," and he physically drags her, and she declares, "Alexander, you're indefeatable, you're Aniketos." So he physically drags her and makes her give an oracle. But it's perfectly plausible. I'm certain he went to Delphi and got an oracle before he took part in the campaign. It'd be crazy not to.
And now to sum it all up, this is always everyone's favourite question whenever I do the podcast. He says sarcastically, if I could take only 3 pieces of information from this podcast about Alexander or the times that he lived in, what would those 3 pieces be?
Well, sum Alexander up in 3 things. Well, rather than 3 pieces of information, I'd say 3 important consequences of Alexander's life. One is that he caused the Macedonian Empire to become the most powerful empire the world had ever seen at that point.
Yeah.
And he was responsible for its greatest growth. But the downside of that, the flip side, is that he was also responsible for its ultimate decline, the decline of the core of Macedon itself.
Yeah.
And Macedon, unlike the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic Empire, went through this process of quite slow but quite painful decline in the late 4th and early 3rd century. So there's that double element of his reign. The greatest growth, but also Macedon itself doesn't do so well, and the aftermath of his death. The other thing is a kind of longer term consequence. He's the model for the Hellenistic kings, who then become very important models for the Roman emperor. So Alexander's kingship is an important influence on his successors, and then longer term on the Roman emperors themselves. And Caesar learns how to be a ruler by visiting Egypt and seeing how Cleopatra is ruled. And
which of course is
Cleopatra's Egypt is much less powerful than Rome, but
Yeah.
he learns how to do it from that. And that's another one of Alexander's long-term consequences. And the third I'd perhaps mention is this idea of the godlike status you mentioned, the idea of the worship of the ruler, which is something that
the Roman emperors
existed
even,
long before, but with Alexander, the connection of power and divinity go hand in hand quite closely.
And the Roman emperors really picked that one up,
Yep,
I think.
they do.
Yeah.
And it's in the Greek world where the Romans first become deified.
Yeah.
People like Flamininus, who liberated the Greeks at Philip V, had these cults in his honor, and others too, Caesar and Augustus and others as well, and the emperor as figure of cult.
Yeah.
And that's again something that carries over into the Roman Empire and thereafter as well. So in those ways, I think that the long-term consequences of Alexander, one of the important things I would say that you could take away from this, the idea of what he did to Macedon, what he did to ideas of kingship and the Roman Empire, and this idea of the divinity of the ruler too.
All right, well, brilliant. When we started, it was bright outside, and now it's quite dark.
Now it's quite dark,
So I think that's a nice way to wrap up the podcast. Shane, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
It was really, really interesting, really great, really enjoyed it. If you enjoyed today's podcast and want to find out more or get involved with Classical Youth Society of Ireland, you can contact us via any of our social media pages on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Classical Youth Society Ireland, our Twitter at CYSI_, or for any direct inquiries, you can email us at cysiofficial@gmail.com. Today's podcast was produced by myself and edited by Michael Fuller. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you all next time.